the figure of the Gamonal appears. He is a landowner who uses land ownership to control the indigenous people.
He went to his Huatila estate, and all the children kissed his hands. In the second year of his journalistic reporting, a woman did not kiss the boss's hands. And did Mr. Omandi have her arm cut off?
When the boss walked by, you had to lower your gaze, and if you didn't, you could get whipped in the face.
During much of the Middle Ages in Europe, the predominant system in Western Europe was feudalism, a system characterized by a hierarchical society that was based on clearly defined power relationships and divided into three orders: the nobility, the clergy, and the peasants and serfs. The nobles had access to lands called fiefs, which were worked by the serfs and peasants, who paid them homage and gave their labor to the feudal lord, and they paid taxes to the nobility and the clergy in exchange for protection. Several centuries later, in a South American country called Peru, where I come from, in case you didn't know, a similar system existed in various parts of the country, especially in the rural Andes. Ville. The upper classes, mainly from the capital Lima, acquired large estates, where the state had a very weak presence.
The landowners had influence over the local authorities, the police, the judges, and access to land. The workers, mostly of indigenous descent, received small plots of land, housing, or food in exchange for their work.
They often received very low wages or even none at all. Many large estates grew through illegal or violent appropriation of land by local bosses over several decades with the consent of the governments. In general, productivity levels were very low, with precarious conditions for the peasants.
Any resemblance to reality is purely coincidental.
Yes, Sebas map, but the context differs, so you can't compare it to the Middle Ages.
Well, yes. It wasn't feudalism in the medieval sense, but many scholars argue that everything I've mentioned to you, which is well documented and proven, at least showed semi-feudal or manorial features. The curious thing about all this is that the man who was in charge of eliminating this system, Juan Velasco Alvarado, is one of the most controversial presidents in the history of Peru.
In fact, the story I was taught in school and around me was that Velasco carried out an agrarian reform, expropriated the land from the landowners, and gave it to the peasants. Since the peasants didn't know anything about management or administration, agricultural production collapsed, and the Peruvian economy went down the drain. What a catastrophe, thanks to Velasco and his Robin Hood complex.
There's hardly a more simplistic and reductionist narrative, not even Putin saying that Ukraine is basically Nazi. So in today's video, we'll look at the facts, and then you can tell me your opinion about it. First, how did land ownership end up in the hands of a few? And what were the consequences that established a semi-feudal system in Peru? And second, was it really as catastrophic as they made it out to be? Are you interested? Then stay until the end of the video.
They would take the red-hot iron used to brand cattle and use it to brand the buttocks of the indigenous people.
He was convinced that he was intrinsically biologically superior to the Indian.
The landowner decided if they would be educated. Until the men, for example, they could have sexual relations with the indigenous women there. And it wasn't even seen as rape.
Here are scenes from the documentary The Revolution and the Land, which covers this topic in more detail. You can watch it for free on YouTube. Testimonies of these types of abuses are well documented, and there are plenty of them. So how the hell did we end up in this unfair and abusive situation all the way into the second half of the 20th century? It's time for us to talk about history in depth.
It turns out that when Peru was born, with these approximate borders, people lived under a system of encomiendas inherited from the Spanish era. During his time as dictator of Peru, issued a decree in 1824 that sought to distribute communal lands among the indigenous people. However, it backfired on him. Oh, Simon! Not even when he tried to do things right.
The individualization of land weakened the collective protection of communities, which laid the groundwork for Creole landowners to expand their lands during the 19th century. Starting in 1845, the famous era of guano and saltpeter began, during which Peru entered an economic boom.
Juan Castilla's government stands out, who clearly favored the landowning elites.
Oh, but what are you saying? El mapa de Sebas.
He was the best president of Peru because he abolished slavery.
And he also gave a juicy monetary compensation to the landowners for the freedom of their slaves, which, combined with the economic boom, allowed them to buy more and more land. Land, more money, more power, more abuses, simple logic, same style, no action.
At the end of the 19th century, the period known as the aristocratic republic begins. The aristocratic era begins.
The name says it all. Rulers like Nicolas de Pierola favored the concentration of land. The landowners no longer only had economic power, but also exercised de facto political power over their lands. In 1902, the American company Cerro de Pasco Copper Corporation arrived and acquired huge tracts of land in the departments of Pasco and Junin. In 1920, Augusto Bileguía enacted a constitution that recognized indigenous communities for the first time. It all sounded very nice, but as many historians say, his reform was only on paper, not in practice, because the landowner system remained practically untouched. The following governments of Benavides, Prado, and Odria continued to protect the interests of the landowners until in the second half of the century, a superpower with alternative ideas to capitalism rose to prominence.
Whether it was because of this powerful anthem or because of its ideas of wealth redistribution and social justice, Marxist and Leninist ideas began to take hold in Ibero-America, especially after the events on an island in the Caribbean. Peru was not immune to this influence. Uprisings and the formation of labor unions began, especially in the province of La Convención in Cusco.
One of the most prominent leaders of the time was Hugo Blanco. So controversial that some call him a terrorist and others remember him as a union leader who, be that as it may, it was clear that under the large estate system, Peru was the perfect breeding ground for the proliferation of communist guerrillas.
Which, spoiler, happened later.
For that reason, during Fernando Belaúnde's first term, despite being another president with right-wing ideas, he chose to enact an agrarian reform in 1964. The really big problem, the lack of political will in Congress, which made his reform as useful as elections in North Korea, which, in case you didn't know, do exist. This is when the protagonist of our video enters the scene, the army commander who comes to power after a coup d'etat that forced Belaúnde to escape from the government palace in his pajamas.
Does he pay him the greatest tribute of all by handing over the entire nation a law that will put an end once and for all to an unjust social order that has kept people in poverty and inequity, to those who work a land that is never their own.
Under the slogan, "Peasant, my landlord will no longer feed off your poverty," General Juan Velasco Alvarado begins the agrarian reform, not just on paper like Leguía or Belaúnde, but in practice. More than 15,000 estates were expropriated, nearly 10 million hectares were distributed, and agrarian cooperatives were formed to manage the land. Sure, and the estate owners just sat back calmly.
Well, they were compensated
Through debt bonds. Was it good? Was it bad? Have your own opinion. Mine is pretty obvious. What interests me the most is that Gamonalismo, the estates and peonage, were eliminated, which meant a tremendous social advance.
Eliminating a system with semi-feudal traits in 10 years, not bad, right? All very nice. Yes, but what do you say about the tremendous economic crisis that scared Peru?
Don't come here to idealize Velasco, please. Okay, all right, I won't. Because in fact, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. And not just because of the authoritarianism and proven corruption of Velasco's elites. I'll tell you why, Leo.
We saw the years 68, 69, 70, which was the military coup of Juan Velasco Alvarado. We witnessed the collapse of Peruvian corporate agriculture.
Well, it's time to analyze this narrative. Was agrarian reform really that disastrous for the Peruvian economy? First, let's look at macroeconomic data. According to the World Bank, throughout the entire Velasco era, Peru's economy grew, even reaching 9.4% in 74. Not bad, right? In fact, the only year of recession during the so-called crisis of the 70s happened in 78, 3 years after the end of his government.
Agricultural production, which is related to the reform, did drop. Don't defend the indefensible. Well, yes, why would I lie to you?
According to data from the IPE, the productivity of Peruvian agriculture dropped by 17% during the 1970s.
Let's give a point to the traditional narrative. It is true that the agricultural cooperatives largely failed because the farmers who formed them did not have the technical and administrative training to manage large companies. In addition, the amount of work done by the farmers dropped dramatically. Therefore, production also dropped, which is a natural consequence of the end of large estates, where workers were exploited.
We also have to consider that compensating the expropriated landowners was not exactly cheap for the Peruvian state. The total debt incurred was estimated between $1 billion and $8 billion, which came to represent up to 4% of Peru's GDP. But the cherry on top, the one nobody tells you about, was the oil crisis of 73.
In October 1973, OPEC declared an oil embargo that sent crude oil prices soaring worldwide. The price of a barrel of oil rose to as much as $3.65 as supply cuts were announced. Peru, as an oil importing and not oil producing country, was severely affected. The increase in energy prices automatically makes everything else more expensive. Inflation increased, the price of imports went up, production costs rose, and so on and so forth. Can you guess what?
It wasn't just Peru that declined economically. The effect was regional. A while ago, you saw that Peru fell by 2.6%. Well, Chile, another oil-importing country, fell by 12.3%. In conclusion, the crisis of the 70s was a combination of several factors. The poor management of the agrarian reform was one of them, but not the only one. With just 1 year of recession, calling it a catastrophe is, in my opinion, at the very least exaggerated. My humble opinion, and you can let me know in the comments if you agree or not, is that social progress mattered more.
Because man, having a semi-feudal agrarian system in the second half of the 20th century was serious business. But now you tell me.
Which do you think matters more? A country's social and ethical growth or its economic growth? Did your country have any agrarian reform? Leave your comment. See you next time. Bye.